Okay, we'll go ahead and get started just in a couple of minutes, y'all. We'll give folks a moment to arrive since not everyone with us has used Zoom before, so we'll give it just a couple of minutes. I see a few people still popping in, so we're going to give it maybe 2 more minutes. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with a few different just housekeeping announcements. One, this webinar will be recorded, so if there's any need to rewatch it later, we'll send it to you after, probably actually next week, but maybe this week I'll talk to Craig about it. But just know that this will be recorded. We have the chat disabled, I believe, other than being able to send chats to myself or Craig. There's also a Q&A section that you should be able to see where you can put questions. I'll have that up so that I can respond. You're welcome to put them in as we go, and I'll take a moment to answer them as we go through things. And the other piece to note is that I work remotely, and so I am at home with a 70-pound love bug of a dog who sometimes barks. And it sounds like there are reindeer on my roof today because my apartment building has a roof leak. And so if you happen to hear anything from that, just know they didn't tell me that they were working on it until this afternoon, and so I didn't have time to drive up to another place. So we're working with what we can in the office. I'm going to, for my sake, turn off my camera while I present, just because I know that it helps me stay more present because I'm not as focused on y'all seeing me. And so I just also wanted to give that disclosure because it just helps me stay more present in what I'm talking about versus what I look like. So, but I wanted y'all to see my face prior to us getting started. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. You are here today for the LGBTQIA+ sexual orientations and gender identities workshop. This is one of 2 webinars. We'll do one this week and one next week. That this is the foundation of talking about LGBTQ identities. And then next week, we'll go specifically over how to ensure equal access in our spaces and in our work to LGBTQ folks. A little bit about me. I think it's helpful just to learn about why I'm presenting on this topic and who I am. So my name is Samantha Foss. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as genderqueer, which we'll define later in this presentation. But that essentially means I don't use she, her, hers pronouns, though, as you saw, I am very femme presenting. And femme meaning feminine of what the United States considers feminine. I also identify as pansexual, which is another term we'll define later. And these identities inform my work, both personal and professional. And so really my goal is to continue to advocate on behalf of my community, no matter what role I have in or outside of work. And so I'm excited to be able to spend this afternoon talking with y'all about the LGBTQIA+ community. Right now, I'm the Director of Development and Communications at Texas Homeless Network, but my background in social work has been varied. I have my master and bachelor social work degrees from Texas State University. I also did my undergraduate thesis on interventions for trans youth. And I've also done a lot of work in shelters. So I spent about 10 years in domestic violence work, working in shelters, working overnight as a survivor advocate, working on the National Dating Abuse Helpline, working in supportive housing. So a lot of the things that we'll talk about, particularly next week, I have direct experience of all of the challenges that come working in shelters and projects that make it hard for folks with marginalized identities to feel safe. Other than that, one of the notes I like to make is just as we go through this and as you go through any of those topics in your agency, if we just don't know who is ever in the room, some of our colleagues may be a part of the LGBT community, or they may have family in the community. I always put summer survivors of not only domestic violence, but also housing instability and homelessness and all of the ways that we don't know someone's background by looking at them. So it's important to stay respectful, present, and open as we go through this information. The first thing I want to dive into is why we're asking you to spend your time learning this stuff. This slide, it shows that LGBTQ youth have a lot of different reasons why they report experiencing homelessness. A disproportionate number of LGBTQ folks experience homelessness each year in the United States, although particularly with the adult population, that exact number is unknown. The only real numbers we have, and obviously they're still heavily underreported, is about 320 to 400,000 youth that are LGBTQ experience homelessness every year. The most commonly cited reason for LGBTQ youth to become homeless is running away from families who reject them due to sexual orientation or gender identity. The second most commonly cited reason is being forced out by their family despite preferring to stay at home after disclosing their sexual orientation or gender identity. And another common reason is running away from the foster care system due to harassment and violence against their identity. Folks that are LGBTQ have many risk factors when they become homeless, and many of those same risk factors leave them oppressed into chronic preventable homelessness. LGBTQ youth have increased rates of high-risk survival strategies, such as survival sex, which can be listed under sexual behavior, but really one of the biggest, greatest risks is physical or sexual victimization on the streets. LGBTQ youth who experience homelessness between the ages of 10 and 25 are 70% more likely than homeless heterosexual youth to engage in survival sex. Similarly, sorry, I always struggle with that word. LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness between the ages of 13 to 21 years are more likely than non-LGBTQ youth to experience physical or sexual victimization, have a greater number of perpetrators, and have more unprotected sexual intercourse. Now, all of that is to say, I want to be really mindful, and we'll talk about it a few different times over. This isn't due to someone's identity when we start to talk about suicide risk and all of the ways that queer youth and queer adults have higher rates of these things have nothing to do with their identity, but the oppressions that they experience from our society because of their identity. Another important factor to talk about and why we're bringing this up today is really trans folks experience the highest level of discrimination of any category, particularly trans women of color. Overall, 30% of trans people experience homelessness at some point in their life. And most of those people, even after exiting homelessness, still currently or later in life live in poverty for the rest of their lives. 23% have experienced housing discrimination due to their identity, and 15% were verbally, physically, or sexually assaulted at work in the past year. 13% lost a job because of their gender identity or expression. We're going to talk a little bit about that poverty rate and again, why homelessness is more prevalent. The rates of poverty for LGBTQ folks is higher in every category of identity. The graph we're looking at shows that same gender couples that identify as women have higher rates of poverty than different gender couples. Well, one of the good things to note is that same gender male couples have the lowest rates of either. Bisexual women have the highest rates of poverty, whereas people who are straight men experience poverty at nearly half the rate. And the reason we're talking about all of this is we really want to talk about the things that are kind of stacked against folks that are LGBTQ and the reasons why it's important to be mindful of all of the different barriers that they face because of simply who they are. We're going to start with this quick video. Oops. To get us starting to talk about identities.
In order to get on the same page about LGBT youth homelessness, let's first talk about the differences between sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. They are all different. We think of each existing on a spectrum. Being on a spectrum means that there are more than just two ways to be. There's a whole range of ways to be. Sexual orientation describes an individual's emotional and/or physical attraction to another person or people. Gender identity refers to a person's innate identification as a man, woman, neither, both, or some other gender. A person's gender may or may not correspond to the sex assigned to them at birth. While gender identity is someone's understanding of their own gender, gender expression refers to the way that a person communicates their gender to the world. It includes all of the external characteristics and behaviors that are socially defined as either masculine or feminine, such as dress, grooming, mannerisms, speech patterns, and social interactions. Social or cultural norms can vary widely, and some characteristics that may be accepted as masculine, feminine, or neutral in one culture may be assessed differently in another. It is important to note that someone's gender expression may or may not align with traditional perceptions of gender identity. Again, gender is a spectrum. It's important to remember that there are more than just two ways to be.
So with that as our foundation, we'll do a few different videos to kind of help cement these basic terminologies. We'll be going over many definitions. And the thing I also want to say as we go through these is, as a queer person, it is always a case in which I'm learning. So if you're here as a person that is a part of the LGBTQ plus community, or you have a family member that is, it's important that we stay open and ready to learn, because as uh, a 33-year-old that has been out queer since I was very young, language is always changing. There's new terms, and I'm not an expert on any identity, um, and I'm constantly learning. Right, that's part of the goal of just being in community. The common definitions we'll go over are these ones, which are lesbian, gay, MSM, bisexual, queer, asexual, pansexual or omnisexual, and homophobia. What we're going to look at first is some of, oh my goodness gracious, it just crashed. Sorry. So for the first half of today, we're going to talk about sexuality, and that being the first part. And then we're going to talk about gender identity. The important thing to keep in mind that I'll say over and over again is that sexuality exists beyond gender identity and does not necessarily correlate. And so sexuality really is who you are romantically attracted to or have sex with, and gender identity is who you are. So sexuality is who you go to bed with, gender identity is who you go to bed as. People may experience a variety of attraction to people of all genders, and while sexuality is innate and not a choice, one's understanding of and relationship with their sexuality may change over time. So we'll go over the basic sexual orientations, and just also noting on the slide, as you can see, this isn't at all a complete list.
Sexual orientation is one of the most fascinating aspects of our existence, and that is because sexual thoughts and attractions are experienced inside our minds. Every individual's sexual orientation is a bit different from the other, just like personalities and appearances are slightly...
I'm so sorry, y'all.
Every individual's sexual orientation is a bit different from the other, just like personalities and appearances are slightly different in each person. Different people are attracted romantically or sexually to various features and characteristics in others. Some people do not feel attraction at all and identify as asexual. A person's feelings about attraction can evolve or may stay the same over time. The same is true across cultures and countries all over the world.
From when I was a small child, I remember myself falling in love with boys. Although, from time to time in my dreams, I would be fascinated by a beautiful woman or feel something from imagining a woman. Now, I never found myself attracted to a real-life woman standing in front of me, so I consider myself straight.
From a very early age, I experienced this feeling that would later become attraction towards men. For years, I was so afraid of dealing with my sexual orientation, until at the age of 21, I hooked up with a woman. And that made me realize finally that women are just not my cup of tea. So from then on, I started a process of accepting my feelings and coming out as gay to my family and friends.
I would probably define myself as pansexual. I'm more drawn to the soul and character and less to a specific gender. I had relationships with all genders, as each of them met a different emotional need of mine. And for the past 3 years, I've been living with an amazing woman who I'm still madly in love with.
As you can see, there is a wide variety of sexual orientations. Human sexual orientation is a spectrum. As we open our minds further, we learn to respect and accept the differences in each other, and realize that love and attraction may come in many forms.
So hopefully that video not only gave you a break from me, but also gave you an overarching picture of sexual orientations that we'll go over. A person who is a woman who is attracted to other women is a lesbian. A person who is a man and is attracted to other people who are men is gay. Both of those terms tend to be the ones that everyone knows best, so that's why I feel like I feel silly saying them out loud. But I really want to kind of go into some of the other ones. When we talk about a person who feels emotional and or physically attracted to more than one gender, they may identify as bisexual. Now, this is a term that's highly talked about in the community currently in 2022, and we'll talk about the reasons why in a minute. But it's good to know that if someone identifies as bisexual and uses that term for themselves, that's really the one we should go with. It's just generally a person who feels attracted to more than one gender. Well, the first three terms cover folks who do feel sexual attraction to people. People who identify as asexual are people who are valid and are an important part of the LGBTQ community. People who are asexual may or may not have sexual attraction to others and or a desire for physical or romantic relationships. The asexual community has a robust amount of people who identify within the asexual spectrum, but may have a varied term for their identity. Some people may feel romantic connections, but no physical or sexual attractions. Others may feel only sexual attraction after a considerable amount of time of getting to know someone. Some may have no romantic or sexual attraction for their whole lives. And it's important that if you have someone in your life or that you meet that is asexual, that we're not there to tell them that they just haven't found the right one, or they just might need therapy because they're not in touch with their emotions, or assume that they have some type of disorder. It's really important to validate someone's experience and accept exactly the way that they're describing themselves. Asexual is one of the identities that I feel like folks can always learn more about, and there continues to be a lot of resources to get to know asexual identities better, everything from graphic novels to memoirs, online resources. So if you are a part of the LGBT community or feel very aware of all of these identities, I would implore you to continue to learn more about asexual identities in your learning, and it's the one that I'm most interested in continuously learning about too. The next one is men who have sex with men. This is a clinical term that refers to men who have sex with men, whether they identify as heterosexual, bisexual, neither, or some other identity. It started and became in heavy use during the HIV and AIDS epidemic, when men didn't identify as gay, but medical providers were trying to do treatment and or prevention if they were having sex with men. Today, this term is commonly used by older men of color, particularly Black men. Next are the terms pansexual and omnisexual. People who are pansexual and omnisexual feel attraction regardless of another person's gender identity and or gender expression. So when we talked about bisexual on the last slide, this is kind of the reason why it's highly talked about right now. Many folks who had originally identified as bisexual now use pansexual. Many younger generations are using pansexual instead of bisexual. Some people feel like one term or the other is more inclusive, but really, if people use pansexual, omnisexual, bisexual, all that matters is knowing what word they use to describe their sexual identity and accepting and using that for them. I know that there tends to be questions around that, so feel free to chat them in if you have them. Okay, so the next one is a term that's rarely used. And actually, in all of my years of doing these trainings, it's rare to hear someone that self-identifies as questioning, but it's a good thing to talk about, just to say that folks may be in a space, whether they're a client or a friend or yourself, where they're still learning and exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity. An umbrella term used to express a person's fluid orientations and identities is the term queer. And honestly, one of the things that may happen when you hear that word is, depending on your age, you may have a visceral reaction of shuddering or feeling this discomfort with the word queer because of its long history of being used as a tool of violence, and that's absolutely true. However, younger generations and many people of all ages have reclaimed this word as a powerful identifier. It's likely right now you hear people defaulting to this identity and using it freely. And it takes a lot of work for me to not use queer or to use queer instead of LGBTQ throughout these presentations, because I grew up in a generation and I exist in a community that loves the word queer. The only reason I don't use it heavily in these sessions is because there is a very valid and real history of that word being used as a weapon. But again, it's important to know that if someone is using the word queer to identify themselves, to use it for them and with them, but not to blanket that term on anyone, because it may be a very triggering word for some people. The last word is homophobia, which, while it's not a sexual orientation, it's important to really talk about all of the different ways that it impacts sexual orientations and people's identities, and all of the reasons we talked about before, because this is essentially negative feelings, attitudes, actions, behaviors, all of the different ways that people enact violence, whether someone is in the LGBTQ community or perceived to be. The important thing to note here is just that acts of homophobia can be blatant, like using a slur, having physical violence, or voting against the rights of LGBTQ people. But they can also be subtle, such as telling someone they don't act gay or that they look straight, or asking a lesbian who's the man in the relationship. All of those different ways that our internalized and externalized homophobia leaks out into the ways that we interact with people. Many of our subtle homophobia and microaggressions can be well-intentioned but are incredibly painful. And so one of the things I would say, again, if some of this feels elementary to you, is to really go through and Google microaggressions against trans and or queer people and look at the examples that exist on the internet of things that are very harmful and hurtful for people that are LGBTQ that you may be accidentally doing. You'd be surprised how many times people look up and realize that they are saying and doing some of the things that hurt other people. And I would think about looking at microaggressions examples for all marginalized communities and thinking and analyzing the way we're interacting with folks. We're going to do a quick little recap video again to give you a break from my voice, but is another good way to explain some of the sexual orientations. This is a silly kid one, but I have used this video for years because I think it's very cute and I love it. So please enjoy.
I never heard of this band. What kind of music do they do? Rock? So what is it, pop? So they do techno, progressive Balkan with a touch of metal? Never heard of that genre. Sexual orientation describes who you are attracted to, may fall in love with, and may have a sexual relationship with. Everyone has a sexual orientation, and there are different words to describe different sexual orientations. Many people are familiar with terms like heterosexual, gay, lesbian, and bisexual. But those aren't the only sexual orientations out there. For example, some people identify as pansexual, which means they are attracted to people of all genders. Many pansexual people feel that gender has little to do with their attractions. In other words, they are attracted to a person, not to that person's gender. Some people are asexual, sometimes called ace. Asexual people feel little or no sexual attraction to other people and have little or no interest in having sex or engaging in sexual behaviors. Many asexual people still feel romantic attraction. They feel love and affection, but may not feel sexual attraction. Demisexual people only feel sexual attraction when they have a strong romantic or emotional connection with a person. These are just some of the labels people use to describe their sexual orientation. Some people don't like to use labels at all, and that's okay too. There are many other terms out there to describe the full, diverse spectrum of human beings, and that's a beautiful thing. Until next time, don't forget to visit me at amaze.org.
Okay, so now that we've covered all of the sexual orientations that we're going to cover today, we really want to talk about some of the barriers to care as it relates to our services in the community. So with sexual orientations, LGBTQ people are less likely to have health insurance, either because they've been rejected by their families when they are young, or because they're unemployed or experiencing homelessness, or because they require services that are not available to them when they have health insurance. This is important to keep in mind during case management, the same way that general barriers to care like transportation or childcare impact our clients. We want to think about the limited access to care that LGBTQ folks can experience. Second, they may experience discrimination or prejudice from healthcare staff or services overall. Bad experiences with inadequately trained professionals are a large reason why LGBTQ people do not seek medical care. Many also report that they look for clues when arriving at a facility, such as the way they're greeted by staff, whether non-discrimination policies are posted in public areas, or if they have single occupancy or gender neutral bathrooms. This is also true for housing options or jobs that deny services to folks that identify as LGBTQ. Or they may be open to providing housing or employment, but be uninformed about considerations such as language inclusivity, safety considerations, or medical needs. Which ties to the third main barrier. LGBTQ people sometimes discover that providers do not have the knowledge or experience in caring for them before or after seeking care from them. And that can be extremely traumatizing to people to get discriminated against due to their sexual orientation in housing, employment, or healthcare. Some examples of this is having a gynecologist push birth control on someone who doesn't have sex with people that are sperm producing. Another example can be a person needing medication like PrEP for HIV prevention and having to report that to a primary care doctor that doesn't understand the applications and what it means in relation to someone's sexual orientation. Another example is an employer who hires a trans person but leaves their dead name or legal name on documentation that everyone can see instead of the name they currently go by. Of course, that's getting into the weeds, but it's useful to have perspective of how frustrating it can be to have providers, employers, or landlords that don't know how to care for you, and how traumatizing it can be to have providers who don't understand you. LGBTQ folks have one of the highest rates of suicide of any population. Trans adults serve in the US military at 2 to 3 times the rate of the general population, but die by suicide twice the rate of their cisgender veteran peers. In a national study, 40% of trans adults reported having made a suicide attempt. 92% of these individuals reported having attempted suicide before the age of 25. Additionally, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to heterosexual youth. While the statistics are staggering, much of the risk of suicide can be mitigated with community and acceptance. One of the things that I will also say as homework is, if you haven't already looked for or attended a mental health first aid training in your area, it's a great way to learn about suicide prevention techniques through expert training. It's free and international, and it's really useful as a way to learn about how to intervene and prevent suicide. Another health consideration when case managing LGBTQ clients is their sexual health care. While many people experiencing homelessness may sell drugs or participate in sex work, the risk for LGBTQ folks to practice sex work and drug use at a higher rate is more dangerous and is something to consider with working with clients, because these stacked depressions of homelessness and marginalized identities create higher danger for folks. We, in our case management, should be thinking about sexual health challenges, offering alternatives for sexual health contraceptives, looking for ways to support our clients in the ways that they need to work to survive. Older LGBTQ folks face additional barriers to healthcare because of isolation, diminished family supports, and reduced availability of social services. Some report discrimination from their peers when living in communal elderly housing, which leaves them vulnerable to housing instability. Additionally, aging on the streets leaves many LGBTQ elders to resort to going back in the closet to survive safely. When assessing a client who is older, it may be important to phrase healthcare questions in open ways that allow them to come out to you if and when they're ready to do so you can more responsively case their needs and acknowledge their barriers to care. Now, before we go to gender, I just want to see if anyone has any questions about sexual orientations. I really ideally try to keep them very separate to make sure people realize what is a sexual orientation versus a gender identity. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on, but feel free to drop anything in the chat that you want to. But we're going to go ahead and move to gender identity. So gender in the United States uses binary, meaning 2 gender categories of male or female. However, gender can be viewed as a spectrum beyond the 2 genders, which we're going to explore in this next section. Gender is a social concept that's used to determine one's behavior and role within a society. Gender varies by country, continent, state, and honestly, even city. Many of our gender roles and ideas of gender have changed over time, and gender does not mean sex composed of chromosomes, genetics, anatomy, or hormones, but is an innate mental identity.
What is the gender binary? Maybe you could help us clarify what the gender binary means.
Binary stems from the word bi, which is two. And so the gender binary really means two gender types, which in our culture is male and female. The gender binary for me was something that I just simply couldn't tether myself to. You know, I saw gender, I see it as this circle, and I saw man and woman as just 2 points on this circle, just these binary points.
And I think what's really interesting about that visual of, you know, the way you visualize it, male and female being 2 points on a circle, is that no one is necessarily trying to say that you aren't allowed as a parent or as a person to identify and to feel like a female or a male, that those exist, but that they aren't just the only two options, that there has to be more options on that circle for people who don't feel exclusively like one or the other, but maybe a combination of the two or totally outside of the two.
But I started doing a little research, and it was that research which was kind of the rabbit hole for me of, oh my gosh, like, there aren't just male or female genders out there. There's a whole world of gender that exists beyond just male and female.
It certainly isn't bizarre that a lot of people really believe that it is just two things, male and female. That's something we see every day in every magazine, on every television show, in every movie.
Shampoo and, you know,
shampoo for her.
Yeah, you know, it's everywhere. The things that we learn when we're little are our deepest grooves, and they're oftentimes the hardest things to break out of.
Yeah, and if you, as a person just learning about this stuff for the first time, feel hesitant or unsure, or it's hard for you to fully grasp at first, I think that what Lauren is saying is that, you know, you may have spent 20, 30, 40, 50 years with this understanding.
I identify outside of the gender binary, and it took me a while to open my mind that I can identify outside the gender binary rather than force myself into something. It took me a long time to learn about my own self simply because I wasn't taught, and I just didn't know it existed. And now that I do, I cannot unsee what I see, you know.
Okay, so as we dive into gender identities, we're going to use the gender unicorn as our starting point. This is a great tool that is created by trans students that is a really helpful visual way to think about our gender identity. So gender identity, which is depicted, as you can see on this unicorn, as the rainbow in a thought bubble, is coming out of the unicorn's head because it takes place in the mind. Gender identity is internal. It's mentally constructed as our identity. While we often think of male and female as one's gender identity, it can exist on a spectrum. Some people may identify 100% as male or 100% as female. Some identify as half and half, feeling that identity, that they embody both male and female qualities. And some folks may fluctuate between identities or through identities. And some folks may exist completely outside of the binary of male or female. And so you're going to see this spectrum of opportunities, and it's useful to think as we go through these where you fall on them. As someone who is non-binary, I feel, as I approach most of my days, that I would put myself completely in the other genders category. I just don't feel aligned with either male or female, where you may be a cis woman, and we'll go over what cis means in a second, but you may be 100% on the female side or 100% on the male side, and there's nothing that, like we were saying in the last video when they were talking to Lauren, was that that doesn't mean you can't. It just is helpful for all of us to realize we have a gender identity. Gender expression also exists on a spectrum and is based on the cultural definition of feminine and masculine. Someone may dress 100% feminine, or what we would consider in the US as feminine, or 100% masculine. You're going to see that as the green dots that talk about the outside of the gender unicorn. This may mean that some people change their clothes, their hairstyle, their accessories, their nails, the way they communicate their body language, tone of voice, etc., to fit their gender identity, but that's not always the case. For example, a person may dress in feminine clothes but be a male, or a woman may dress in masculine clothes but be a female. It's safe to say that you can't assume someone's gender identity based on their gender expression. A really translatable example is a woman with short hair dressing in flannels, work boots, and Levi's can be a woman, right? When we think of women that dress in more masculine clothes, but are women, in the same way that a person can dress in a dress with a beard and a deep voice and identify as non-binary. It's the way that we express ourselves outwardly doesn't necessarily always align with our gender identity. And to kind of loop back to what we talked about earlier, who we're physically or emotionally attracted to also exists on a spectrum that may or may not reflect who we end up in a romantic relationship with. So like, let's think about, I may be very physically attracted to men, but only date women who I am most emotionally attracted to. So I'm going to choose my partner based on that romantic connection, not just a physical connection. Or I may be equally attracted to women as I am to men, but only find myself dating men. I may be physically attracted to all genders, but feel most emotionally attracted to people who are non-binary. A good example of this is women who are emotionally attracted to and form deep, intimate, close relationships with their friends, but are only physically attracted to men and therefore only date men. This tends to be a really aha moment for people that are straight and are attracted to the opposite gender physically, but really have really strong emotional attractions to the same gender. So we think about women who have platonic life partners of their best girlfriend that they would do anything for, and maybe even plan life decisions around where they're living because they want to be close to her, or they may do vacations with her, but they only are physically attracted to and therefore only have intimate partnerships with men. Another example is someone who would consider their normal physical attraction to women being on the low side of the spectrum, but they end up marrying a woman. So they may say, I'm not very attracted to women, but they end up falling in love with a woman, right? And end up being married to them. And that's just talking about all of the different ways we can fall on this, right? Our sex assigned at birth can be female or male or other/intersex, but really our gender identity exists on a spectrum, our gender expression exists on a spectrum. And these two, the gender identity and gender expression, exist separately from our physical or romantic attractions. Now that we've kind of talked about the gender binary, we can also talk about pronouns that are associated with genders. Pronouns are what we use to identify someone or something without using their name. If you are a woman, it is likely people use she, her, hers pronouns when speaking about you. When you are talking, they say, she is talking, so I listened to her. She told me the backpack is hers. They're using your pronouns to talk about you. If you are a man, people may say, he is speaking, I listened to him, he told me the backpack is his. However, if your gender is outside the binary, like Lauren in that video, you may use they, them, theirs pronouns. These pronouns are called gender neutral pronouns and are more and more common, and folks like myself are using them. Instead of using she or her, which is attached to the binary gender, you use they. So when people are talking about you, they may say, they are speaking, I listened to them, they told me the backpack is theirs. Another alternative to they, them, theirs is Z, here, self, or Z, yourself. Not as many people use these pronouns, but they are also gender neutral. And this is another good learning opportunity. If you are in here and feeling like you know a lot of these things already, I would highly encourage you to practice using the neopronouns of Z, here, here's, or Z, zers, because folks still do use them. And practicing and being ready to use them when you meet someone that uses them just helps you be ready to be inclusive and responsive to people's language. Many people push back on the singular use of they when talking about one person because they believe it's plural. But that's simply not true. I feel like we're in 2022, so you may already really know this, but if you see a wallet on a table, right? And when you find it, you say, I hope they come back for their wallet. You know that it's only one person's wallet, yet you've correctly used it as a singular pronoun. The same way as if someone cuts you off in traffic, you may say they're a jerk, which is very fair. You know it's only one person driving the car, but since you can't see them, you've correctly given them a gender neutral pronoun. There's tons of times in which we know there's one person doing something, but we use gender neutral they, them pronouns because we don't know their gender. What people really stumble with is when a person is in front of them, they take behavioral clues to identify a gender, but it's still just one person. It's also important to note that you can't assume someone's pronouns based on how they look. Like as we talked about before, their gender expression may not lead you to their pronouns. And so that's important of why we need to be really responsive and know people's pronouns before we start to assign them. With pronouns, it's crucial that you know and you remove from your language that pronouns are never preferred. They're simply a person's pronouns. You'll see a video in a little bit that says sometimes people have preferred pronouns if they use more than one set of pronouns, but if you're a beginner to all of this, it's best to just remove preferred from your vocabulary since it implies there's an option to not use someone's pronouns. If you identify solely as female and you were assigned female at birth and I talk about you and I say, he is very kind, you will be at the very least surprised and tell me that you're not a guy and do not use he. If I say back, okay, well, what are your preferred pronouns? You're gonna say, they're not preferred, I'm a woman. You know, you get where I'm going with this. People who do not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, or those whose authentic identity is not male or female, don't choose this. There is no option. Their pronouns are their pronouns no matter what. So when asking a person what pronoun they use, you can say, what are your pronouns? But don't say, what are your preferred pronouns or what pronouns do you like? It's literally and very simply, what are your pronouns? Now you may be asking yourself, when should I ask? Should I ask? How do I know they won't get offended? And the easy answer is that there is no easy answer. When asking a client, you may say, to make sure I address you respectfully, what pronouns do you use? Or I see on your intake form you marked that you're male, what pronoun should I use when addressing you? Better yet, offer your own pronouns when talking to a client. So when talking to a client on a phone, I may start it with, hi, my name's Samantha. I use they, them pronouns. How can I help you today? A person may or may not offer their pronouns back, but it's a good way for me to start to signal that I understand and respect pronouns and that I'm an aware and active ally or someone that is LGBTQ. If they don't offer their pronouns back, you don't have to force it in the moment. You can move on and build more rapport or choose to ask in that moment if you feel like a client would be receptive. If you decide to wait until you build a little bit more rapport, it's just important to not use any pronouns. The best way to do this, and what people do for me all of the time, is they just say my name over and over again instead of pronouns. So replacing the she, her, he, him with my name and having that be the pronouns. So now we're going to go into a little bit of terminology. We're going to focus solely on gender identities in this section, and many of these identities are not listed in the LGBTQ acronym we talked about earlier, but some are. So transgender is the T in LGBTQ, and queer is the Q. Otherwise, many of these identities fall within the trans umbrella. The trans umbrella is this graphic. I'm going to show it just for a second because it's not exact. This is an old graphic, so I'm going to pull it away. But this trans umbrella is just a way to show many of the identities that fall within the trans identity. Transgender, or trans for short, is simply defined as someone who is a different gender than the one they were assigned at birth. The opposite of transgender is cisgender. Cisgender means someone who is the sex they were assigned at birth. So if you identify with the gender you were told since you were a baby, you're cisgender, or cis for short. It's important that if you identify with the sex you were assigned at birth, you remember your identity as cis. Cis people need to know their pronouns, gender identity, and sexual orientation just as much as queer folks. An older acronym you may see it with older generations or younger folks who still like to use it is MTF or FTM. MTF stands for male to female, and FTM stands for female to male. This means that a person was assigned female at birth but identifies as male, so that's the FTM, or were assigned male at birth and identify as female, which is the MTF. While this term feels good for some people, it can feel not in alignment with others, because really the root is that it implies that someone started as male or female, rather than the fact that they were incorrectly assigned the wrong gender at birth. If that doesn't make sense to you, because I know that that's a lot to take in, the real thing to know is that if someone uses MTF or FTM to talk about themselves, to use it for them too. At this point, it's also a good time to talk about the word assigned. So rather than saying a person was born male or born female, it's important to shift our language to assigned male or assigned female, because this again reflects more clearly the experience of trans folks who do not feel like they were born male or female, but instead that they were born their true identity and assigned something that's not congruent with their identity. No one asks a baby their gender identity, so we essentially do our best to guess, and sometimes we get it wrong. While we guessed them to be male or female based on their external genitals, which is essentially all doctors do, they may tell us that we later got it wrong. All we have to do at that point is to acknowledge we assigned them to the wrong gender and correct it based on their identity they are telling us is right. So I'm going to go into a little bit of an example because I think this is the hardest thing for folks to grasp. So say a baby was born with an external penis. Long ago, we as a society decided that people with a penis would be labeled male. A doctor doesn't look at hormone levels or chromosomal levels. The doctor delivering the baby sees a penis and declares it as a boy. The parent is overjoyed with the baby and names him Alex. The parent begins to raise Alex as a boy, and in our culture starts to enforce gender roles on the kid. So he's dressed in blue, given cars, told not to cry, and prompted to play sports. Along the way, Alex may or may not fight these behavior assignments, right? However, eventually Alex comes to his parents and said that he is female. Her family thankfully embraces her identity, and with the support of her parents, Alex's risk for suicide decreases by 40% just because her parents are accepting her. She begins to change her gender roles, or what we call gender norms, to fit in what we as a society closely correlate to being female. So she may start wearing pink, painting her nails, or growing her hair longer. While none of these external behaviors change her identity, she is working to be socially read as what she has always known she was, which is a female, by cueing to the outside world her gender identity through her gender expression. We call this social transitioning. It's important to note that no amount of transitioning makes someone's identity more valid. Alex could choose to keep her hair short, remain in boxy clothes, and never wear makeup. She could choose to start hormones or get gender confirmation surgeries, or she could choose to not do any medical transitioning. Passing as a female, i.e. looking like what America thinks a woman should look like, is not the bar someone must reach in order for us to respect them. The moment that Alex declared her identity is the moment we respect it. She could never change a thing about herself, and she's still a female. Another term for Alex, which is more popular, is AMAB, which means assigned male at birth. Now, for a transgender male, it would be assigned female at birth, or AFAB. This is just a term a little bit closer to the current representation of gender by highlighting that Alex was never a male, but was assigned male by that doctor who saw her penis the moment she was born. I hope I haven't lost you, but if we have, we're going to continue to go over it. We're going to skip this video. Now we're going to go into a little bit more of gender identity terms. As we talked about earlier, queer is the biggest term in current history since it's the biggest umbrella of them all. When someone is queer, they are vaguely stating that they're a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. They may be straight and trans, or they may be queer and cisgender. Needless to say, queer does not give you much information about a person, which means you still have to do work to understand them. If the client identifies as queer, all you can assume is that they identify under the LGBTQ umbrella of all of these different terms. Genderqueer and gender fluid both are terms that describe a person who sees their gender identity as fluid. They may identify sometimes as male, sometimes as female, and sometimes as neither. This could include their gender expression, like what they wear, or be more of an internal process with no gender expression change. Many people who identify as genderqueer or gender fluid may change pronouns or keep static pronouns. So it's just important as a case manager or a friend that you ask them regularly what pronouns they're using. People who identify as gender nonconforming or non-binary usually do not identify as male or female. They do not fit, nor do they want to, into our concept of the gender non-binary or the gender binary. Their gender expression may or may not be aligned with the gender they were assigned at birth. Intersex is a common term describing a person with less common combination of hormones, chromosomes, and anatomy that are used to assign sex at birth. There are many examples, but parents and medical professionals usually coercively assign intersex infants a sex and have in the past been medically permitted to perform surgical operations to conform the infant's genitalia to that assignment. This practice has become increasingly controversial for very good reason. And it's important that if you are looking for ways to become an active ally, that you look into ways to support the intersex community and changing the narrative around these forced genital assignment procedures. The term intersex is not interchangeable or synonymous with transgender, though some people who are intersex identify as transgender. Transphobia, while not an identity, is important to pay attention to. Trans women of color, as I talked about earlier, are the most likely to be murdered solely due to their identity more than any other trans-identified person. Transphobia can be violence, both physical and verbal, and can be tangible or intangible, like hate speech. And in this moment, I'd also like to note that these definitions and terms are commonly used and accepted. Right now, language is alive, and some of these terms may be outdated by the time that, by the end of the year. So really, it's important to stay up to date with language by engaging with the LGBTQ community on an ongoing basis. And while many of these definitions are widely accepted, it doesn't mean that everyone who is LGBTQ agrees with these definitions. So it's crucial when building rapport with the client or anyone in your life who is LGBTQ that you ask them what their identity means to them and mirror their language. If they tell you they are gay, but by definition are a lesbian, you still use the term gay when talking about their identity because that's how they talk about themselves. It's more important for a client to be mirrored and seen rather than just trying to prove that you know a definition of a term and trying to correct someone on their own identity. This one doesn't have captions, so if you need them, you can go to YouTube and search gender identity, being female, male, transgender, or gender fluid.
Hi, I'm Jake Edwards and I am a non-binary YouTuber and musician. Some bright lights. Why are pronouns important? Well, pronouns are a part of the language you use to address a person, and they change depending on who you're talking to, and you should always address someone with respect. Deciding not to use the correct pronouns for a trans person is a huge sign of disrespect, and will most likely lead to that person feeling deeply uncomfortable and possibly even unsafe in your company. Personal pronouns are not, as people popularly believe, just he and she. The singular use of they/them pronouns have been around since the 14th century, and was used as a gender-neutral pronoun. The use of they/them has been gradually increasing since the 1970s as singular personal pronouns, as the need for gender-neutral and inclusive language has progressed. Today, it is widely understood that gender is a spectrum, just like sexuality. We have people who sit at very fixed binary points of male and female, but many people exist in the space around those points. This is called non-binary. Many non-binary people like to use they/them pronouns as they don't implicate a binary gender and make them feel uncomfortable. It's important to remember that you can never be sure of a person's pronouns just by looking at them. Gender is a spectrum, and the way we express and present our gender to the outside world is just as vast as that spectrum. Asking a person what their pronouns are is not rude. It can be a little bit intimidating at first, but once you get into the habit, you can be confident that you won't be incorrectly assuming a person's pronouns based on how they present. This is a positive step forward, as it normalizes the behavior of not making assumptions and not linking a person's clothing to how they identify. Really good? Awesome. Many people argue that they/them pronouns are plural and cannot be used as a person's singular pronouns because it's confusing. Much of the English language is confusing, and it's not uncommon to have words that have multiple meanings. Some people just don't realize how often they use they/them in a singular context already. For example, Jamie is bringing a friend over, but I don't know their name. It's used to refer to a person whose gendered pronoun has not yet been identified. So why not use they/them for one person? If someone you meet has pronouns that are they/them, you should respect that and use them, because the impact of misgendering them can take a huge toll on their mental health, and it's extremely disrespectful. Since the 14th century, pronouns outside of he, she, and they have been brought into our language. These are pronouns like a, lee, sie, and thon. Although most of these aren't in use today, they are a part of what we call neopronouns. It can be hard to learn to conjugate these pronouns, but if you meet a person who uses them, it doesn't hurt to give it your best shot and take direction from them. or even look it up for yourself. It takes a small amount of effort on your behalf, but it will most likely mean the world to a person who uses neopronouns. I feel like my eye is twitching. The landscape of our language is always changing and adapting to suit our needs, just as more labels for sexuality have come around over the years. Gender identities have gone through the same thing. Non-binary is an umbrella term that encompasses many labels. Gender fluid is someone who considers their gender to be fluid rather than fixed on one point. Bigender is someone who identifies as two genders, which could be male, female, or a number of other things. Agender is someone who doesn't have a gender at all, and so on. These identities are vast and unique to each person, and no one really feels their gender in the same way. For many non-binary people, using he or she can make them uncomfortable, but lots of people use multiple pronouns. I personally identify as non-binary, and my pronouns are he or they, and that's because I feel a connection to masculinity, but I often feel very fluid and unconstrained by masculine ideas. The term preferred pronouns only comes into play when a person uses multiple pronouns but has a preference. This preference can change day to day as their gender fluctuates. My preferred pronouns are they, but only because they're not the only pronouns that honor me. A trans person does not have preferred pronouns if they only take one set of pronouns. Saying that someone with one set of pronouns has preferred pronouns implies that they have multiple, and in doing so you risk thinking it's okay to misgender them. So using the correct pronouns is not optional. It's okay to ask, respect how labels and language are evolving, and always be open to learning new things. We all have to start somewhere.
Okay, now we're going to go ahead after that video to make some assumptions. So if you could think for a moment about what you imagine this person's name, sexual orientation, gender identity, and pronouns are. So you're going to kind of just reflect on if you were to see this person. I mean, you wouldn't see this person like looking like this on the street, but if you were, what would you think this person's name, sexual orientation, gender identity, and pronouns are? Usually if we have the chat going, I'd have you guys be able to put it in chat, but that is not an option right now. And I'm sure you knew this one was a trick question, but I want to just point out how easy it is in that first picture to make a lot of assumptions. Here are more pictures of this person. These pictures are of the same person. Rain Dove is a genderqueer model who plays with gender in their art. Rain uses they, them pronouns, and their sexual orientation is queer. We're going to go to the next person. We're going to think about this person's name, sexual orientation, gender identity, and pronouns if we were just making broad reaching assumptions. This person is Aiden Dowling. He uses he, him, his pronouns. He is attracted to females and is a trans man. And that is his little baby, who is not little anymore. And here are many other celebrities that are trans. In the top left is the infamous Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black, who's a trans woman. On the top right is Janet Mox, who is a trans woman activist and author. In the middle here is Jazz Jennings, who is a trans woman famous for her show I Am Jazz. On the bottom left is Nico, who is from the hit TV show Younger, and their partner Bethany Meyer. Both them and their partner use gender-neutral they, them, theirs pronouns. In the middle bottom is Elliot Fletcher from the show Shameless and The Fosters. He is a trans man who uses he, him, his pronouns. And lastly is Liv Hewson, most recently known from Netflix's Santa Clarita Diet, who uses they, them pronouns. The important thing to note about any of these celebrities is you can't tell their gender identity from looking at them. And that is neither a good or a bad thing. A common word used to describe someone who is perceived to be cisgender is passing. Passing means that a person is not read as trans and is often unfortunately used as a measure of how attractive or valid someone is. A trans woman who is passing is someone who looks like she was assigned female at birth, but often this takes extensive amounts of resources, such as access to gender affirming surgeries that can add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars through the American healthcare system. Many of these celebrities pass due to their access to disposable income that folks who identify as trans women in your community don't have access to. This makes them no better or no more valid than celebrities who identify as trans women. These examples are not meant to be used to study and examine so that you can quote unquote spot folks better. It's just a point to highlight that there is no one look for being genderqueer, non-binary, or trans. People have different gender expressions, gender identities, and different desires and definitions of what it means to transition. There's no one way to be or look trans, non-binary, or any other LGBTQ identity. I think that this is my last video and it is my favorite video. They have strong accents, but I'll have the captions on that will hopefully help. But this really sums up a lot of what we've talked about around gender identity today, and I feel like it's just very helpful as like a summarization of that.
Say it one more time. Non-binary. Sorry. 3, 2, 1.
When we think of the word gender, a whole lot of images rush to mind.
Most of us are taught the idea
that people are born a boy or a girl.
And we're expected to act a certain way based on what's between our legs. But that actually isn't true for everyone.
It totally ignores the huge and amazing world of people who are trans and gender diverse.
And that's what we're going to dive into in this series.
Being trans, gender identity, and what it's all about.
Welcome to Trans 101.
Traditionally, we tend to think of gender as decided by the body we're born in.
People are usually assigned female or male at birth.
But bodies and gender are actually pretty separate things.
Gender is basically part of someone's internal sense of self.
It can be male, female, neither, a mix of both, or exist totally outside of that.
A person's relationship with their gender can also change over time as well.
The gender we're assigned at birth usually gets reinforced by the people around us over our lives.
Hearing things like, be a man, or you're such a girl.
It can feel like we're being told who we're supposed to be.
Most people feel comfortable with the gender that they're assigned.
But for some people, that label never quite fits and doesn't feel right.
That's what's called being
transgender.
You probably heard the term transgender or even gender diverse.
That's when your gender doesn't entirely match the one you're assigned at birth.
A lot of people use trans for short.
That can mean the gender you were assigned felt meaningless, restrictive, or altogether just didn't quite fit.
That might seem like a pretty broad definition, and that's because it is.
And the most important thing you need to know, there's no one right way to be trans.
There are a lot of different ways people might identify.
It's not about knowing every single one,
but rather being open to difference when you encounter it.
And also keep in mind that gender and sexuality are largely separate things.
Lesbian, bisexual, asexual, gay, and straight are a few different examples.
But we're all those things in addition to being trans.
They're not the reason we're trans.
I think for me, there's kind of been this expectation that I transitioned because I like guys and wanted to get with them more easily. Actually, I'm a super gay lesbian.
When we talk about gender identity, people often think of two opposing groups.
A binary of female and male, and that when you're trans, you go from one to the other, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Putting it simply, non-binary is an umbrella term people use
to describe gender that doesn't fit squarely into male or female.
And this can include people who feel that their gender is a mix of both.
Changes often.
Or is something totally separate.
Or have no strong sense of gender at all.
Different people might use more specific terms to describe their gender, whilst others use non-binary.
And trans people who aren't non-binary,
who identify as strictly male or female,
might describe themselves as binary.
There's also a term for people who aren't trans, that's cisgender.
Cisgender is a way of saying not trans.
You might also have heard it shortened as cis.
Being cisgender is when the gender you identify as totally matches the one you were assigned at birth.
The term comes from Latin, meaning on the same side as.
and is used in contrast with trans, which means on the other side of.
It might be a new word to get used to, but it helps avoid a contrast of trans people and normal people.
And instead, just recognize that being trans or cis are just different ways to be.
So if you're cisgender, this is a great word to add to your vocabulary.
Transitioning is when someone takes steps
to socially or physically feel more aligned with their gender identity.
First is social transitioning.
Social transitioning involves how we interact with people.
Such as coming out as transgender.
To ask people to use different words and pronouns to describe us.
Or changing the way we interact with gendered spaces, like the bathroom we use.
Physically transitioning often involves a person altering their appearance.
To what feels right for them.
Like clothes, makeup and hair.
Or seeking medical support.
which can involve hormones or surgery. Transitioning isn't about appealing to other people.
Or necessarily trying to look like a cisgender person.
It's about a trans person doing what feels right for them.
And what that means for each person is different.
It's also important to know that transitioning isn't instant.
There's a tendency to think of transitioning as something automatic, like there's a fairy godmother who will pop up and magically change everything. Transitioning is a gradual thing.
And everyone's different.
No two people transition the same way.
A trans person's identity isn't defined by the way they do or do not transition.
So if someone doesn't feel transitioning is for them, that's totally cool too.
Gender dysphoria is an intense discomfort a trans person may feel
about physical attributes or the way that they're gendered by others.
Gender dysphoria can be on a social level, a physical level, or even a purely emotional level.
Dysphoria can be really overwhelming sometimes.
Having to live with a body or expression you're not comfortable with can really impact the way you're living.
Trans people find different ways to alleviate dysphoria.
And the positive impact that can have is enormous.
Like transitioning, having dysphoria doesn't make someone more or less trans.
And is not something all trans people experience.
There will be a lot of new words.
We often hear things like, that's grammatically incorrect.
Is that a real word?
Fine, you got us.
You couldn't get any store-bought brand name words.
So we have to go with garden grown, that twice as nutritious.
In reality, all language evolves at a community level.
Every single word.
For trans people, we're developing language that describes who we are.
Because in the past, either a lot of the words haven't existed,
or those that have been created by people outside the trans community.
And don't always reflect our experiences.
When you're talking about gender and bodies, talk about what you actually mean.
People have uteruses instead of women when talking about bodies.
Because some trans guys and non-binary people have those too. Or if you're talking about being a woman, avoid things like people with vaginas and just say woman, because not all women have those.
There's also never a need to say he/she when talking about a group of people.
They will do just fine.
It's shorter, less clunky, and more inclusive.
Using the right language makes trans people feel included. And it's actually more accurate as well.
Learning this stuff so you can be more informed is a pretty awesome thing to do.
So if you found this video helpful,
share it online so you can reach even more people.
And if you want to know more, check out the rest of Trans 101.
Full of even more awesome videos about gender diversity.
So I hope that video was helpful as a way to recap some of the terms we talked about, and they covered some of the ones we didn't specifically talk about. There are lots of identities, so remember that once you feel comfortable with these terms, you can Google to learn more identities that we're not talking about, and maybe they talked about in that video. Now that we've covered vocabulary, I just want to spend a little bit of time to talk about the more practical pieces of things to know when working with LGBTQ individuals. Many of these pieces also apply to gender identity, and so we'll talk about them in both contexts. You may have heard or may have been asked in the past about when did you come out to someone who is LGBTQ. You may have also heard the question of, are you out? Now, just to be clear, these are normal questions that aren't necessarily offensive, but maybe not the most informed, because frankly, no person that is LGBTQ ever comes out once. Coming out usually means that a person is revealing their gender or sexual orientation identity to an individual or group, or sometimes even just to themselves. In some Native American communities, people declare a coming in as presenting oneself and being fully present in their own identity. I bring this up because, again, it shows a social context to morality, and that the revering of this identity to one community cannot be true for another community. Many Eastern cultures believe that being two-spirit or being transgender is the highest honor because it brings both divine energies together as one, and therefore they believe folks are the closest to God. We won't get too deeply into that, but as we talk about the context of coming out, being gay, or being trans, we have to keep in mind the experience of person's coming out process also heavily depends on their cultural and political environment. The process of coming out can be powerful, happy, painful, freeing, dangerous, and an endless amount of other possibilities, but it is a lifetime process of those endless possibilities. If you think about an identity you hold, such as being a mom, a Catholic, a social worker, you may think about all of the ways that you reveal those pieces of yourselves to people. For LGBTQ folks, it's not different, but the stakes are a lot higher because, as we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, many LGBTQ people may reveal their identity and be kicked out of their home, disowned, denied housing and employment, bullied, or even killed. Each time someone reveals their identity, they are quite literally putting their life on the line. When a person who is LGBTQ comes to you, you have to keep in mind that the trust they put in you to not hurt them in that moment or in the future moment with your knowledge. So outing someone can be quite literally the worst thing that you can do because you're revealing a person's gender or sexual identity in ways that can be damaging to them. Whether it is people in our personal or professional life, we need to be completely and often very mindful of not doing this. You may think about the fact that you have this real piece of saying that you may have told someone that your daughter is a lesbian, or you talk about that someone that you go to church with is trans, or you may be sharing stories with no bad intentions. You're proud of that trans church member. You're proud of your daughter who's gay. But we can't do that because it really is a danger of revealing someone's identity as LGBTQ that are risks that they're not asking for us to take for them. No matter what your relationship with a person, it's never okay to reveal their sexual orientation or gender identity. Even if you're the parent, their ex-partner, their best friend, or their caseworker, there's never a reason to reveal their identity without their consent. Outing a person without their explicit and specific consent is never okay. And we'll talk about that next week as well. And these are the same things that we talked about earlier, just with gender identity in mind. When we're thinking about our case management with people that are under the trans umbrella, When we're thinking about gender identity, we can think about that trans people are even less likely than other folks in the LGBTQ community to have access to competent and responsive health insurance. They're less likely to have healthcare options that are responsive and formed on their needs. They're less likely to have insurance that covers things like gender affirming care, such as surgeries or hormones, cancer screenings, things that may need to happen more or specifically around their trans identity. And lastly, trans folks don't have the same protections as cisgender people, and even honestly, a lot of the same protections people do for their sexual orientation. Because the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on trans rights in the United States, this varies considerably from state to state, where folks may have barriers to getting their name changes done. So they may not have any legal documentation that reflects the name they go by. They may not be able to change their birth certificate because of transphobic laws around that in the state they were born in. They may have real or no protection in housing or employment discrimination based on their gender. And many states don't classify violence due to someone's gender identity as a hate crime. And so even thinking about the legal protections against violence vary greatly from state to state. All of these barriers must be taken into account when we're working with and understanding clients that identify as trans and or non-binary. And many of the same concerns we spoke about for sexual orientation identities are also concerns for trans and non-binary clients too. They're just amplified. Trans folks have higher rates of suicide, are more likely to resort to sex work, have higher rates of sexual health challenges, and larger impacts in aging on trans bodies that haven't as been clearly identified. For all these reasons, we need to remain vigilant with LGBTQ identities and considering their higher vulnerability to mental and physical health impacts when we're thinking about their case management. As we wrap up today, I just wanted to again say that not everyone aligns with the same definitions that I provided in this presentation. The goal isn't for you to walk away with definitions. The goal is for you to have more of just a broad knowledge around LGBTQ identities. Definitions are changing as our community is able to take more control of their narrative. So we may continue to learn new words, or words may change in their meaning, like historically the word queer, for example. So it's important to mirror language on what your client, friend, or family member uses. That is the biggest takeaway you can take away today, is whether it's pronouns or identity specific language, just to mirror what folks offer to meet you, and also understand the true diversity and fluidity of expression. One of the things to keep in mind that we'll talk about next week is things like how we use language in intakes, how we think about approaching identities and expressions during case management. And so I would highly encourage y'all to come next week as we talk more specifically about how this translates to our everyday work with folks, both at our jobs and in our communities. I know we're technically over time, so if you have any burning questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll answer them. But otherwise, I would again say, if you haven't registered for next week, we have an equal access training that talks about HUD's mandates for equal access, but it goes beyond that of just talking about the ways that we can make sure we're responsive in our care for our clients, and then also our agencies have things in place that ensure inclusive and equal access to our programs. If you have any questions, feel free to chat them in. Otherwise, I will see y'all next week. I'll give you a minute to type out in case you have anything. That's also my email in case you have a question you don't want to ask in front of everyone. Otherwise, we will call it a day, and I hope y'all have a lovely rest of your week and see you next week.